They called her traitor's seed, and they said it the way people say words they have long stopped questioning, as a fact of the world, as permanent as stone. She had heard it her whole life, murmured in corridors when she carried her candle to the lower archives, snapped at her when she forgot to lower her head in the presence of her betters, occasionally said with a faint, satisfied pleasure, the way people say it when they want to remind themselves that some wounds are inherited. She had never answered them. She had learned early that silence was not the same as agreement, and that the lower archives held more truth than any tongue in the upper keep. She had been collecting that truth for 20 years, and the night had finally come to make them hear it. Somewhere above her, the most powerful man in the northern Pax was preparing for the Cold March, the once-in-20-year ritual of fealty. 7 lords gathered. The whole court assembled, every lie in the building dressed in ceremony and candlelight. He did not know she was coming. Or perhaps he did, and that was worse. If you have Davradsar, say. What comes next is the reason this story was buried. The year of the Iron Moon had been 873 by Pack reckoning, which meant the winter of 893 was exactly 20 years since they had brought her father in chains to the Great Hall and read the charges against him in a voice designed to carry. Lyra had been 4. She remembered almost nothing of the trial itself, only the cold floor against her knees when they made her kneel and watch, and the way the steward's voice had sounded, rich and satisfied, when the sentence was announced. Her mother had gripped her hand so hard Lyra's fingers had gone white, and then they had taken Aldrich out, and she had never seen him again. What Lyra had instead of a father was 20 years of documents. She had spent them all in the lower archives of Kailmark Keep, where the ceiling wept condensation in winter, and the shelves were choked with the cast-off paperwork of 3 reigns. The things no one thought to burn, because no one remembered they existed. She had been given the post at 15 by a court that found it easier to contain her there than to banish her outright and create a martyr. They had assumed she would be harmless. She was not harmless. She was the most dangerous thing in the building. And the sealed iron box on the shelf at her elbow, no larger than a loaf of bread, was the reason. Old Moret had found her in the archive that morning, before the lamps were lit, pressing her forehead to the shelf where the box sat. Merritt was the head cook of the lower keep, 63, and built like a woman who had decided the world would simply have to accommodate her. And she had known Aldrich when he was alive and worth knowing. She had been the one, 20 years ago, who had wrapped Lyra in her own cloak and carried her out of the great hall before the execution. She was not a woman who wept easily. And she did not weep now, but she stood in the archive doorway and looked at the box, and then at Lyra's face and said very quietly, "Tonight." Lyra said, "Tonight." Marit was still for a long moment. Then she said, "If he does not listen, they will put you in a cell." And Lyra said, "Then I will speak from the cell." Merritt turned and walked back to her kitchen, and Lyra opened the box for the last time to check that everything was still inside. The forged testimony, the letter, the original, water-damaged, misfiled document that had taken her 6 years to locate in a flooded lower chamber, the one that carried Drav's personal seal authorizing a false witness named Jarn to testify that Aldrich had passed battle plans to border rogues. Drav had believed it destroyed. It had been misfiled in a folder labeled Grain Tallies for the year 869 and had simply waited in the dark. Patient as all true things are patient. She had been 14, the first time she understood that the archive was a language, not a storage room. She had been sorting grain tallies from the year 862 when she turned up a sheaf of military dispatches, misfiled with the quarterly provisions. The dispatches were routine, mostly, but one of them had a notation in the margin in a hand she did not recognize. 2 lines about a shipment of silver ore to the eastern border, initialed D. She had not known then what it meant. She had set it aside in a separate folder she kept inside the cover of a water-stained volume no one had touched in 40 years. A ledger of stable accounts from the previous king's reign that sat at the back of a high shelf behind a broken table leg. that folder had grown. Over 9 years, she had found 17 other documents that referred obliquely to the Eastern silver trade, to payments whose destinations were labeled only with a location code she had eventually decoded by comparing it against shipping registers from 3 separate years. The location was the border pass where the rogues had been provisioned. Her father was supposed to have provided that provisioning. The documents showed that someone else had, 18 months before the trial, in amounts that no Omega-ranked pack member could have sourced. She had never shown these to anyone. They were not the killing evidence, only the framing of the picture around it. The letter was the killing evidence, and she had found it 4 months ago in the flooded chamber, and had spent 3 months making sure she had not made a mistake. The Cold March ritual required the 7 lords to gather by nightfall and maintain attendance through midnight when the Alpha King renewed the fealty of the assembled packs. It also required that all present take a cup of the ceremonial wine brewed with coldweed extract, an old tradition meant to prevent wolf shifting during the ritual's peace hours, so that the assembly could not descend into dominance displays during the sacred ceremony. Lyra knew this because she had archived the Cold March protocols herself, 3 years running. She also knew it meant that when she stood before the 7 lords and the king and the steward tonight, none of them would be able to shift. None of them would be able to invoke the brute physical authority of the wolf. They would be, for exactly 3 hours, only men. The great hall filled slowly through the afternoon. Lyra watched from the upper archive window, having borrowed a candle from Mamoret's kitchen on the pretense of late cataloging, and tracked each lord as his retinue crossed the courtyard below. 7 banners. When the 7th crossed the gate just before dusk, she put her hand on the sealed box and breathed. She had planned this for 2 years. She had waited 20. She went downstairs to dress. She was halfway through the lower corridor, the box under her arm and her heart loud in her ears, when she heard his voice before she saw him. Kalen of Kaelmark, Alpha King of the Northern Packs, rarely came to the lower keep, and when he did, the air organized itself differently. The way a room's acoustics change when a large door opens somewhere it should not. She had seen him at distance across the great hall twice. In the past year, she had thought she knew what she would feel, standing near him. She had thought she would feel only the particular cold of old hatred, the kind that has been stored so long it becomes something close to fact. She had been wrong. He was standing at the foot of the stair with Tomas, his second, and he was reading a paper someone had handed him, and his face in the lamplight was not the face she had assembled from rumor and distance. It was older than she expected, and more tired, and there was something in the set of his mouth that she recognized without being able to name it. The look of a man who has carried a weight in the same position for so long he can no longer feel where the weight ends and his body begins. He looked up from the paper. The lamplight caught her face. He went still, not the stillness of surprise, but something else. Something controlled and deliberate, as if he was deciding whether to recognize what he was looking at. His eyes stayed on her for 1 breath, then 2, then Thomas said something at his elbow and he looked away. Lyra walked past and did not let herself run. She did not understand yet why her hands were shaking. She understood it later, but not then. He came to the archive an hour later. She had not expected it and had no protocol for it, no prepared face, no position that was not simply herself standing among shelves of documents, with a lamp and a folder she had been reviewing to pass the time before she could do anything useful. He did not knock. He came in carrying the lamp from the corridor and set it on the end of the nearest shelf and looked at her across the narrow room. And the archive was small enough that the 2 lamps between them made the space warmer than it had any right to be. He said, "Lyra." Not the archivist, not the girl, not Traitor's daughter. He said her name, the first syllable flat and the second lifted slightly. The way a person says a name they have known for a while, and are only now saying aloud. She looked at him. She said, "You know my name," he said. I have known your name for 20 years. He was silent after that, as if the sentence had cost him something and he was waiting to see if he needed to spend more. Lyra set the folder down on the shelf beside her, very carefully, so that her hands had something to do. She was aware of the heat from his body across the distance between them, which was 5 feet at most, and of her own heartbeat, which had not been reliable since the corridor. He looked at the shelves, at the years of folders and documents and on cross-referenced indices she had built. He said, "What are you looking for exactly?" she said. "I already found it." He looked at her again and something moved in his expression, and then he steadied it, and he put his hand on the shelf, near her shoulder to lean, and stopped when his fingers were an inch from the wood near her arm, and did not complete the gesture. He straightened, he said, "Thomas will collect you at dusk." He left. And Lyra stood in the warm archive with both lamps still burning, and her heart louder than the building around her, and thought about the words he had said. He had known for 20 years. He came here to see if she was what he had suspected, and she had not understood what she was confirming. And she still did not know what she felt about any of it, and there was no time to find out, and the cold march was 3 hours away. Drav found her in the preparation hall an hour before the ritual. He was a large man, the steward, 55, and still carrying himself like a man accustomed to filling a room. And he had a way of speaking to her that was entirely without alarm, which told her how thoroughly he had always dismissed her. "Traitor's seed," he said pleasantly, as if he were noting the weather. "Still digging in the mud where traitors belong. What are you carrying?" She was carrying a folder of documents she had prepared specifically for this moment, the decoy 6 pages of legitimate archival notices she had bound to look like the contents of the sealed box. She held it out without hesitation. He took it, flipped through it with the half attention of a man performing a check he expects to pass, and handed it back. "You are not attending the Cold March tonight," he said. "Keep's staff do not attend," Lyra said. "I have an archival matter for the council." Drav looked at her with the faint, comfortable contempt of someone who has never lost a bet. "You have nothing that concerns the council," he said. He walked away, and Lyra counted to 10. And then she reached inside her dress and confirmed that the strap of oilskin sewn to the lining was still there, and the copied documents within it, thin as pages pressed flat against her ribs. She had made the copies herself by lamplight over 4 nights. The originals were in the iron box, which was currently in Moret's kitchen pantry behind a sack of milled grain. Drav had just searched what he thought was the threat. He had not found the threat, because the threat was already inside the building, had been inside the building for 20 years, and was standing in front of him in a kitchen girl's dress. Tomas appeared at her shoulder 20 minutes later while she was waiting in the corridor outside the great hall. He was a quiet man, broad and careful, and he had a habit of standing at angles that suggested he was watching something other than what he was actually watching. He said without preamble, "The king requests you attend the Cold March as an observer. You'll stand at the east wall." Lyra looked at him. He did not look at her. "He has been told," Tomas said, at precisely the volume that meant he was not going to say it again, "that the archival matter is real." Lyra's heartbeat had not been steady since the staircase. She thought of the 16-year-old who had signed her father's death sentence, and the 36-year-old who had just arranged for her to attend the one ritual where she could speak before every lord in the building. She thought she understood something then, and she was not certain she wanted to understand it, because understanding it meant reconsidering the shape of 20 years. She said, "Tell him I accept." She took her place at the east wall as the hall filled. 7 lords, their retinues, the ceremonial wine going around. She watched Drav take his cup and drink, watched the warmth leave his expression when he noticed she was there, and watched his eyes move from her face to the space below her arm and find no box. She saw the calculation that crossed his features, and then she saw the decision. He leaned toward a man on his left. That man left quietly through the side door. She had perhaps 12 minutes. She had 9. They came for her while Kaelin was still at the dais preparing to speak the Cold March opening words, a guard on each arm. Drav's man at the lead, and they walked her out of the great hall, with a minimum of disruption and a maximum of speed, the way people remove problems before they can name themselves. Lady Hess of Morn, standing near the east wall, watched them take her past with an expression of bright, comfortable satisfaction, and said to the woman beside her, perfectly audibly, "They let that girl walk the upper corridors? Aldrich's spawn. I've never understood why the king permits it." The guard took Lyra down 2 flights to the lower keep cells, a short stone room with an iron door and 1 torch, and locked her in, and took the folder of documents from under her arm and left. She stood in the cell and listened to her own breathing. She could hear, faintly, through the stone, the beginning of the Coldmarch ceremony above her. Kaelin's voice, low and formal, the words of the fealty opening. She pressed her back to the wall and reached under her dress for the oilskin strap at her ribs, and it was still there. She peeled it away from the lining and unrolled it carefully in the torchlight. 12 pages, copied by her own hand, including the letter with Drav's seal authorizing false testimony from Jarn, the man who had stood before the court in 873 and lied her father to his death. The originals were still in Marette's pantry. The copies were in her hands. She was in a cell with a locked iron door and the evidence that would end Drav. And the ceremony was starting without her. She pressed her palms flat against the stone floor and breathed through the cold of it. The damp that came up from the rock in winter, the particular smell of the lower keep cells, which was moss and iron and old water and nothing alive. She had been in worse places. She had been in the archive at 3 in the morning with her lamp running out of oil and the cold coming through the ceiling stones, had been in the flooded lower chamber with water at her knees, finding a folder that held the thing that would end a man's 20-year career of protected crime. She had not been afraid then. She was not precisely afraid now. She heard his voice through the stone. Kaelin's voice beginning the Cold March its opening. And she had not understood until this moment how much of her attention it commanded. How the frequency of it was different from other voices, how she had filed it away without meaning to, the quality of it in a large room. She pressed her back to the stone wall and held the pages against her chest and listened to him speak above her head, not the words, only the cadence, and thought about what it meant that he came to the archive and said her name. He said he has known for 20 years. He arranged for me to attend. He knows something, and the question is whether what he knows is the same as what I know. And the answer to that question is upstairs in a hall full of 7 lords who have drunk their ceremonial wine. And the ceremony's starting without me, and I am in a cell. Then she heard Kaelan's voice stop, not pause, in the way a speaker pauses for emphasis. Stop entirely, mid-sentence, leaving the word hanging in a hall full of 7 lords and their retinues and the sound of a ceremony severed at the root. Silence is remarkable in a full hall, and this silence was of the kind that precedes something irrevocable. She heard Tomas's voice, quieter, and then what sounded like a word or two from Kaelin, short and final. Several minutes passed, and then footsteps in the corridor outside. And then the door of the cell swung open, and Kaelin was standing in the doorway. He had the iron box in his hands. He looked at her hands, and at the pages she was holding, and then at her face. Neither of them spoke for a moment that was not comfortable, but was honest. She saw it in his expression before he named it. The thing she had not expected, the thing she had spent 20 years steeling herself against seeing. Not surprise, not political calculation, something more costly than either. The box was in the cook's pantry, he said. His voice was very level. Thomas found it when I sent him to look. Lyra looked at him steadily. The originals, she said, the copies are here. She held them up so he could see. He was still for a moment, looking at the pages in her hands and then at the box in his own. And she watched him make a decision she had not known he was capable of making. The decision to walk back into the room where 7 lords were waiting with ceremonial wine in their blood, and no wolf to save him, he said. Come upstairs. The walk up the stairs was the longest she had taken in her life, and also the shortest. 2 flights of stone, lamplight from above. The sound of the hall growing closer. At the top of the stair, just before the door, he stopped and did not turn, and she stopped behind him. He said, at the door, not loudly, "What he did to your father was wrong. What I allowed is worse." He was quiet for a moment. "I am going to open this door." He said it as a simple fact, with no request in it, and no offer, and Lyra thought that this was the first honest thing a king had said to her. "And I have been waiting for it since I was 4 years old, and I do not know yet if it is enough. And the only way to find out is to walk through the door behind him." She said, "Open it then." He put his hand on the iron handle, and she watched the muscles of his forearm, the steadiness of it, and the door swung in. And the sound of the hall hit her like a wall of warmth and candle smoke, and the held breath of 40 people who had not known, until a moment ago, that the Cold March was going to be different this year. He walked in front of her, and she walked behind him, and the corridor was cold and lit by wall torches, and she was 24 years old, and she was carrying her father's truth against her ribs. And the man ahead of her had signed the order that killed him. The great hall went quiet when she entered behind the king. She was aware of every face, of the steward's expression moving from confusion to rapid, cold calculation, of the 7 lords arranged in their seats, of Tomas at the right flank. She was aware of Lady Hess's voice stopping mid-sentence. She went to the center of the floor and stood there with the papers in her hand and the iron box on the table before her open. Drav said, from his seat near the right wall, the words coming out smooth and confident and carrying the certainty of a man who has survived 20 years of knowing a dangerous thing and being the one who controls its danger. She is nothing. She has always been nothing. A trader's daughter with a folder of old papers, and you stop the Cold March for this. Several of the lords shifted, uncertain. One of them leaned toward another. Kaelin, at the dais, said nothing. He had set the iron box on the table himself and stepped back from it. And his arms were at his sides, and he was looking at her with the expression she had seen on the staircase, the one she still could not name. Except that it was not indifferent, and it was not cold, and it was 20 years old at least. Lyra put the copies on the table beside the box and said, in the year of the Iron Moon, my father Aldrich was tried for treason. A witness named Jarn testified that Aldrich had passed battle plans to the border rogues. These documents carry the steward's personal seal, authorizing that testimony, written to Jarn 4 weeks before the trial. My father did not pass those plans. The steward did. Jarn was paid. She paused. The hall was very still. I have held copies. The originals are in the box. She looked at Jarn, who was standing near the far wall, where he had stood at every Cold March for 20 years as part of Drav's retinue, old now, 60-something, and watching her with an expression she recognized. The expression of a man who has carried a wrong thing for so long he has almost stopped, knowing it is wrong. Almost, she said. Jarn? Just his name. Just that. He looked at the table and then at Drav and then at the 7 lords, and he sat down very slowly, and something in his face came apart. He said to no one in particular, in a voice that sounded like a man setting down a stone after a very long walk, it was true, all of it. She's right. Drav stood. The chain of office at his throat caught the candlelight. He said, this is a fabrication. Assembled by a girl who has spent her life in the lower archive nursing a vendetta, and I will not stand in my own hall and be stopped, Kaelin said. Drav, one word, very quiet. Drav went still. Kaelan came down from the dais. He came slowly. The way a man moves when he has decided something, and the deciding is already done, and what is left is only the doing. He came to the table, and he picked up the documents from the iron box, the originals, the water-damaged letter with the steward's seal, and he looked at it. The hall was so still that Lyra could hear the torch near the east wall burning. She watched him look at the document, and she looked at his face, and she saw the thing she had not been prepared for. Recognition without surprise. He had seen this before, or something like it, or he had known what was in it without needing to read the words. His jaw was set. His hands were steady. He looked up from the page and looked at her, and for a moment he was not the Alpha King, and she was not the archivist's daughter, and between them was something with no name yet, only wait, she said quietly, so that only he could hear it. You knew. She said it as a question. He looked at her for 1 second longer, then he said, in a voice that was not loud, but that carried the particular quality of a thing, said finally after a long time of not being said, so that every person in the room heard it in the silence. I knew. The hall took a breath. I have waited 20 years for someone brave enough to make me say it aloud. The silence after those words was the longest silence Lyra had ever been inside, and then one of the 7 lords rose from his seat. Lord Den of the eastern border, who had served the longest, who had seen 3 kings and known what each of them was worth, got to his feet and looked at Kaelin and then at Lyra. He picked up his cup, the ceremonial cup of the Cold March, and he said, the fealty of this house belongs to those who hold the truth and pay its price. He set the cup down on the table near the iron box. He was not kneeling, but the gesture was a form of kneeling, and the Lord beside him understood it and rose, and then the next, one by one. Not immediately, but in the way things topple, when the first weight shifts, deliberate and irreversible. Drav was still standing. He turned toward the hall door, and Tomas was there, 2 of Kalon's guard at Tomas's back. And Tomas looked at Drav without expression and said, the steward will remain. Drav looked at Kalin, and what passed between them was 20 years of leverage dissolving into nothing. And Drav sat down very slowly, as if his joints had forgotten how. Jarn was weeping quietly. The tears of a man who had not known until this moment how badly he had needed to put it down. Kalin turned from Drav and turned to Lyra. 7 lords standing, the hall watching. He went down on one knee on the flagstones of his own great hall, the stone cold through the wool of his trousers, and he stayed there, and the assembly held its breath. And Lyra looked down at him and felt something she had not built a name for yet. Something that had been forming without her permission since the staircase, since the lamplight, since he had said her name in the archive, and she had not understood how he knew it. He looked up at her from the floor. His face was not concealed. It was open in the way a face is open after a long tension releases, exhausted and clear. He said, your father's name belongs in the pack register. Restored and clean. I will write it there myself. And you. He stopped. He looked at her for a moment that contained more than it should have. And then he said, in the flat, plain way he said all the things that mattered, stay. She stayed. They kept Drav through the night in the lower keep cell, the one where they had put her, and in the morning 3 of the 7 lords witnessed the steward's full confession, the account of 873, the payment to Jarn, the forged testimony, the way he had held Kaelin's younger brother Ren against the sentence for 4 hours until the execution was carried out, and the crime was permanent, and the leverage was real. Ren had sent a letter from the south, sealed with the mark of his own house, 3 days before the Cold March. And Kaelan had been carrying it inside his coat since it arrived. It confirmed every detail of the hostage night from his own memory. The letter had not changed what Kaelan already knew. Nothing in the archive had changed what he already knew. What had changed was Lyra, standing in his great hall on the 20th anniversary of the wrong, with the copies against her ribs and the originals on the table, steady as the center of a room in a storm, and he had understood something he had not let himself understand before. That the waiting had been cowardice dressed as protection, and that she had done in 24 years what he had failed to do in 20 of carrying. And that the only honest answer to that was the floor. Drav was stripped of the steward's seal and sentenced before noon. Jarn was stripped of his position and his house, and exiled to the border settlement where the border rogues had once run, which was not a poetic irony, but simply the place that had room for him and not much else. Lord Rennick of the Southern Pax, who had attended the Cold March at Kaelin's invitation, and who had watched the entire night from a seat near the east window with the expression of a man revised by what he is witnessing, stood at the morning council and said, without any of the skepticism he had carried in. The Southern Pax acknowledged the judgment and its weight. He said it looking at Lyra, not at Kaelin, and Lyra accepted it with the composure of a woman who has been waiting a long time to receive acknowledgement in a language she could hear. The pack register was opened that afternoon in the council chamber, with 4 witnesses present: Lord Den and Tomas, and an elder of the archival order, and Marette, who had been brought up from the lower keep in her working dress and who stood with her arms crossed and her eyes bright and her jaw set, watching Kaelin write the name in his own hand. Aldrich of the House Vayan restored. The year, the season, the truth of him returned to the record in black ink. Merritt said nothing. She did not need to say anything. She put her hand briefly on Lyra's shoulder and left it there for a moment, and then went back to her kitchen. The iron box was empty now. Lyra had carried it back down herself the morning after the cold march, walking through the lower keep corridor in the gray light before most of the household was awake. The documents were in the council's official archive, logged and sealed under the new register. The box had served its purpose and was no longer dangerous and was no longer heavy, and she set it on the table in Marette's kitchen because there was nowhere else it felt right to put it. The way you set down a thing you have carried so long that putting it down is its own kind of ceremony. Marette made tea. Outside the kitchen window, the courtyard was white with snow, the long frost settling properly now that the cold march was done, and the morning light was the thin, clear, cold light of a winter that has decided at last to be honest about itself. Lyra wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the box, and thought about her father's name in the register, and thought about a king going down on his knee on cold flagstones and staying there, and thought about the word he had said, the last one, the plain and final one that had cost him more than the kneeling. She thought about what it meant to spend 20 years holding a wrong in your hands, and not yet having found the person who would make the holding worth the cost of speaking it. She thought about what it meant to be that person. 3 days after the cold march, the keep felt like a building that had set down a breath it had been holding since before she was born. The upper corridors, which she had never walked without her eyes down, were hers to use without instruction. The archivists who had ignored her for years came to her, now, with questions about where things were filed, with requests for guidance on the restoration of the water-damaged lower records, with a diffidence that was not respect yet but was moving in that direction. She did not gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. A wrong had been corrected, and a name had been restored, and a man had been stripped of a seal he had carried like a weapon for 24 years. And none of it brought Aldrich back, and none of it gave her back the years she had spent building her case, instead of building a life. What it gave her was what she had asked for, no more and no less. She thought about that in Marette's kitchen on the 3rd morning, and decided it was enough, and then thought about the note that Tomas had brought, and about Upper Keep East Wing, and about the plain declarative way Kaelin had said stay, and decided that enough was perhaps not quite the word. Tomas knocked on the kitchen door at mid-morning and came in without waiting for an answer, the way Kaelin's men did when the message was from Kaelin. He put a folded paper on the table next to the iron box, without meeting her eyes in the way of a man who has been told to deliver something and has. Decided not to have opinions about it, Lyra opened it. 3 lines in Kaelin's hand, plain and without ornament, the way he spoke. She read them and looked at the empty box for a moment, and then at the snow. Marit across the kitchen did not ask. Lyra looked up. He says, she said, because Marette had earned knowing that my quarters have been moved. Upper Keep, East Wing, she paused. And that the archival records of the past 20 years require review by someone who knows what they contain. Marette looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman who has waited a very long time to be right about something. She said nothing. She refilled Lyra's cup. Outside, the snow was still falling and the courtyard was clean. And somewhere in the upper keep a register sat open to a page with a restored name on it in black ink. and the box on the table was empty and light, and nothing at all like a weapon. And Lyra sat in the warm kitchen with her hands around the cup and let the morning come.